At exactly midnight on the 7th day after my grandfather's funeral, the old watch stopped ticking. For 6 nights it had sounded like a heartbeat beside my bed, though the jeweler in town had sworn it was broken beyond repair. On that 7th night, I stood alone under a street lamp outside the closed Veterans Hall on Maple Street, one hand near my coat pocket, every nerve in my body awake. Across the road, a black sedan idled with its lights off. Then the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out in a dark service uniform, his silver hair cut close, his shoes polished like glass. He walked toward me slowly, not threatening, not hurried, as if he had been expected. When he reached the yellow pool of light, he raised his hand and saluted. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you passed." A cold wind moved through the empty street. I looked down at the watch in my palm, at the cracked face, and the hands frozen on 12, and for the first time since my grandfather died, I understood that his will had never really been read in that lawyer's office. That was where the story only appeared to begin. My grandfather, General Thomas Whitaker, passed away on a gray Tuesday morning in early March. He was 91 years old, though if you had asked him, he would have said age was just a number invented by people who liked excuses. He had lived in the same brick house in Virginia for nearly 40 years, with an American flag on the porch, a row of rose bushes along the walkway, and a framed photograph of every soldier he had ever lost, kept in his study. He was not a soft man, not in the usual way. He did not gush, he did not flatter, but when he loved you, he showed it through presence. He showed up early, stayed late, remembered small things, and corrected you when no one else cared enough to. I was his only granddaughter, Major Claire Whitaker, United States Army. I had spent most of my adult life moving between posts, deployments, training assignments, and the kind of paperwork civilians never imagined soldiers drowning in. But whenever I came home on leave, Grandpa still asked whether my boots were shined, whether my back was straight, and whether I remembered that rank meant responsibility, not importance. My parents did not understand him. Maybe they never tried. My father, Richard Whitaker, was his only son. He had inherited Grandpa's jawline, but none of his discipline. Dad liked the sound of our last name when it opened doors. He liked telling people at country club dinners that his father had been a general. But he resented the old man's quiet judgment, especially when Grandpa refused to bankroll every bad investment he dressed up as family business. My mother, Elaine, had spent years pretending to be long-suffering. She had perfected that sigh women use when they want strangers to know they have endured more than anyone can see. Together they visited Grandpa mostly when they needed something, money for a renovation, a signature on a property matter, an introduction to someone important. I visited when I could. Not enough, I used to think. Never enough. The funeral was held at a small Methodist church with white siding and old oak pews. Veterans came in slowly, some with canes, some with medals pinned to jackets that had grown tight around the shoulders. The honor guard folded the flag with a precision that made my throat ache. When the bugle played taps, I kept my eyes forward because I was in uniform, and because Grandpa had taught me that grief did not need to collapse in order to be real. Afterward, people shook my hand. "He was proud of you, Major. He talked about you all the time. You were the one he trusted." Those words should have comforted me. Instead, they made my father's mouth tighten every time he heard them. 2 days later, we gathered at Mr. Callahan's law office for the reading of the will. The office sat above a pharmacy in downtown Fredericksburg, with creaking floors and windows that looked over the courthouse square. It smelled faintly of leather chairs, old paper, and lemon polish. My father wore a navy suit too expensive for a man who complained about money as much as he did. My mother wore pearls and a black dress that made her look prepared for photographs. I came in uniform not for display, but because I had gone straight from a memorial meeting at the base. Dad looked me up and down when I entered. "Still playing soldier," he said under his breath. I took the chair across from him. "Good morning, Dad." He smiled without warmth. "Let's see what your grandfather thought of all that dedication." Mr. Callahan was a thin, careful man in his 70s. He had been Grandpa's attorney for as long as I could remember. When he opened the file, his hands were steady, but his eyes flicked toward me for half a second longer than usual. He began with the house. "To my son, Richard Whitaker, I leave my primary residence, including all furnishings not otherwise designated." My mother inhaled softly like she had just been handed oxygen. Then came the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, the land outside Charlottesville, and several military antiques my father had always admired because he assumed they were valuable. Almost everything went to my parents. Dad leaned back more with every sentence. I sat still. I told myself not to feel foolish. I had never loved Grandpa for his money. I had never expected a mansion or land or any grand reward for being the granddaughter who called on Sundays. Still, there is a particular pain in hearing your place in a family measured out in legal language, while the people who neglected him receive the evidence of a lifetime. Finally, Mr. Callahan looked at the last page. To my granddaughter Claire Ann Whitaker, I leave my field watch. That was all. He reached into a small padded envelope and took out an old watch with a faded leather band. The glass was cracked. The hands were stopped. I recognized it immediately. Grandpa had worn it in every photograph from his later service years. He used to let me hold it when I was little, warning me that time was the one thing no officer could command back. My father laughed. Not loudly, that would have been kinder. He gave a small, sharp laugh, the kind meant to slice. That's your worth, he said. My mother touched his sleeve, but she did not correct him. I looked at the watch resting in Mr. Callahan's palm. Something in my chest tightened, then settled. I had been insulted by better men under worse circumstances. I reached out and took it. Thank you, I said. Dad shook his head. All those years saluting him and he leaves you junk. Mr. Callahan's face hardened. Mr. Whitaker. What Dad spread his hands, it's true. I stood placing the watch carefully in my coat pocket. Grandpa gave me what he wanted me to have. Dad leaned forward, enjoying himself now. You keep telling yourself that, Claire. I left before my discipline became performance. Outside the courthouse bell rang noon. I stood on the sidewalk among ordinary people going about ordinary errands, holding a broken watch that seemed suddenly heavier than my sidearm had ever felt. I did not cry. Not there. Not where my father might look from the window and feel satisfied. That evening, I took the watch to a jeweler named Mr. Bell, an old man with magnifying lenses clipped to his glasses. He examined it under a lamp, opened the back, frowned, and finally shook his head. Major, I'm sorry, this mechanism is shot. Hasn't run in years, I'd guess. Can it be repaired? Anything can be repaired if you spend enough, but this. He closed it gently. Sentimental value is the value. I thanked him and brought it home to my small rented townhouse near base. I set it on my nightstand beside Grandpa's folded funeral program. At 11:58 that night I was still awake. At midnight the watch began ticking. Not softly. Clearly. Steadily. Like someone had wound it from the other side of death. I sat up in bed and stared at it until my eyes adjusted to the dark. The second hand moved once, twice, 3 times, then stopped exactly at 12:01. The room went silent. I told myself old mechanisms did strange things. Springs shifted, temperature changed, grief made meaning out of noise. But the next night at midnight it happened again. And this time outside my bedroom window a shadow moved across the lawn. The second night I did not tell myself it was nothing. At 11:55 p.m., I turned off every light in the house and sat in the dark living room with my back straight, boots planted flat on the floor, the old watch resting in my open palm. I had drawn the curtains halfway, not enough to blind myself, just enough to break my outline from outside. Old habits. You don't stare directly into a window when you suspect someone might be watching. You let your peripheral vision do the work. At 11:59 the house held its breath. At midnight the watch began to tick. The sound was unmistakable now. Not a loose spring. Not a coincidence. It was rhythmic, deliberate, 1 beat per second clean, and controlled the way Grandpa used to tap his finger on the armrest when he wanted to make a point without raising his voice. Tick. 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 I did not look down at it right away. Instead, I let my eyes drift to the faint reflection in the glass of the picture frame across the room. From there, I could see the outline of the front yard without turning my head. Something moved. Not fast, not careless. A shift of darkness against darkness, just enough to tell me that what I was seeing was not a trick of tired eyes. Someone was out there. I closed my fingers around the watch and let the ticking continue against my skin. My breathing slowed on instinct. You learn that early: control your breath and you control your thoughts. Panic is loud, discipline is quiet. The figure paused near the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. I could make out the shape of a person, but not the details. No sudden movements, no attempt to approach the house. Just presence. Watching. The watch ticked for exactly 1 minute. At 12:01 it stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound had been. The figure outside shifted again, then disappeared into the dark, as if it had never been there at all. I waited another 10 minutes before I moved. When I finally stood, I didn't rush to the window. I walked calmly to the kitchen, turned on the light, and poured myself a glass of water. Routine, normalcy. If someone was observing, I would give them nothing to feed on. No fear, no reaction. Only after that did I circle the house, checking each window, each lock, each angle of approach. The yard showed no obvious signs of disturbance, no broken branches, no footprints I could see in the dim light. Whoever had been there knew how to move without leaving a trail. That told me 2 things. First, this wasn't random. Second, this wasn't amateur. I went to bed at 1:30 a.m., though I did not sleep much. By morning, the world looked ordinary again. Sunlight through the blinds, a neighbor walking his dog, the hum of a lawnmower down the street. It would have been easy to dismiss the night as imagination if not for the watch. I picked it up from the nightstand. Dead still, as if nothing had ever happened. At 800, I reported to base. Paperwork briefings, a meeting about training schedules that could have been handled in half the time. The rhythm of military life has a way of steadying you. Tasks, orders, structure. It leaves less room for questions that don't have clear answers. Still, I noticed things. A car in the parking lot that idled a little too long before pulling away. A man in civilian clothes near the entrance who seemed to glance at me once too often. None of it was enough to act on. Not yet, but it stayed with me. At lunch, I sat alone outside the watch in my pocket, my thoughts turning over themselves like stones in a current. Grandpa used to say, if something doesn't make sense, it's because you're missing a piece, not because there isn't one. I had a broken watch that worked only at midnight. I had a shadow in my yard that moved like trained personnel. And I had a grandfather who had spent a lifetime believing in quiet tests. I didn't believe in ghosts. I did believe in him. That afternoon, I drove back to Mr. Callahan's office. He looked up when I entered, as if he had been expecting me. "Major Whitaker," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "How can I help you?" I closed the door behind me. Did my grandfather leave anything else? A pause. Everything was read during the will proceeding. Anything not written in the will. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, a tightening, a carefulness. "Why do you ask?" I placed the watch on his desk. "It's not broken," I said, "not the way we thought." He looked at it for a long moment, then back at me. "Claire," he said quietly, "your grandfather believed that some things should be earned, not explained." "That sounds like him," I said, "but it doesn't answer my question." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." We sat there in silence for a few seconds. Then he slid the watch back toward me. "Take care of yourself," he said. "That's the best advice I can give you." It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night I made a decision. If someone was watching me, I would not pretend otherwise, but I also wouldn't confront them, not yet. If this was a test, as I was beginning to suspect, then the test wasn't about force. It was about control. At 11:50 p.m., I turned off the lights again. This time I left the front curtains slightly more open. I sat in the same chair, the watch in my hand, my posture relaxed but ready. At 11:59 I was already watching the reflection. At midnight the watch began to tick. Tick, tick, tick. And right on cue the shadow returned. Closer this time. Just at the edge of the porch. Close enough that I could see the outline more clearly, a man average build, standing with a kind of stillness that spoke of training, not shifting weight, not fidgeting, just waiting. For me to react, I didn't. I let the ticking continue. I let him stand there. I let the moment stretch. My heart beat steady, not fast. I focused on the sound of the watch, matching my breath to its rhythm. Inhale, exhale, control. At 12:01 the ticking stopped. The man remained for one more second. 2. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark without a sound. I sat there long after he was gone. Not afraid. Not anymore. Because fear thrives in the unknown. And now I knew one thing for certain. This was not about harming me. This was about observing me. Evaluating. Measuring something I had not yet fully understood. On the third morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt since the funeral. Whatever this was, it had a pattern. Midnight. 1 minute. Observation. And withdrawal. A controlled exercise. I dressed for my morning run, tying my shoes with practiced hands, the watch now strapped around my wrist, despite its cracked face. As I stepped outside into the cool air, I didn't look around for shadows. I simply started running. If someone was following me now, they would have to keep up. And if they were watching to see how I handled pressure, uncertainty, and restraint, then I would give them exactly what my grandfather had spent a lifetime teaching me. Consistency. Discipline. And silence. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't to act. It's to wait. By the third night, I stopped asking whether I was imagining it. Patterns don't happen by accident, not in the field and not in life. You learn to respect patterns because they usually mean someone somewhere is making decisions. The watch had ticked for 2 nights at exactly midnight for exactly 1 minute. The figure had appeared both times just within sight, never crossing into the light, never making contact. Observation without engagement. That was not random behavior. That was controlled. On the morning of day 3, I ran a different route. Instead of looping through the quiet residential streets behind my townhouse, I headed toward the older part of town where sidewalks were uneven and oak trees stretched their branches over narrow roads. I kept my pace steady, my breathing even, and my eyes moving, not darting, not obvious, just aware. You don't look for a tail directly, you look for repetition. A reflection that lingers too long. A footstep that matches your cadence. A vehicle that appears, disappears, then reappears again. At the 2nd mile marker, I caught it. A dark SUV parked along the curb, engine running. It had no reason to be there at that hour, not with the engine on and the driver still inside. As I passed, I didn't turn my head. I watched it in the reflection of a shop window. The driver wore sunglasses. At 6:15 in the morning. That told me enough. I kept running. When I reached the corner, I turned left instead of right, an unplanned change. A test. I slowed my pace slightly as if adjusting for a cramp. 30 seconds later, the SUV rolled forward. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just enough to stay within range. I almost smiled. Not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. This was a controlled follow. Whoever was behind it had resources, discipline, and patience. And they weren't trying to hide from someone like me. They were letting me notice just enough. Back home, I showered, dressed, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the watch resting beside it. The cracked face caught the morning light, and for a moment it looked almost ordinary again. Almost. I turned it over in my hands, remembering the way Grandpa used to check it without looking like time was something he felt rather than saw. You don't chase time, he once told me when I was 12 and late for a school event. You move with it. That's how you stay ahead. At the time, I thought he was just being poetic. Now I wondered if he had been preparing me. That afternoon, I received a call from my father. I let it ring twice before answering. "Claire," he said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of irritation wrapped in politeness. "I assume you've seen the transfer papers." "I have." "We're listing the house next week. No reason to sit on it. Market's good." Of course he was. The house wasn't a home to him. It was a number waiting to be converted. "I see," I said. A pause. "Then you're not going to fight it?" "Fight what?" "The will. You got nothing. Or next to nothing." A faint chuckle. "If you want to contest it, now's the time." I looked at the watch. "I'm not contesting anything," I said. Another pause, longer this time. "Well, he said a hint of something sharper creeping in. I suppose you're used to following orders." I didn't take the bait. "Take care of the house," I said. It mattered to him. "It matters to me too," he snapped, just in a more practical way. "I'm sure it does." He exhaled, frustrated. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Act like you're above it, like you don't care." I thought about correcting him, about explaining that not reacting didn't mean not feeling. But Grandpa had taught me something else too. Not every truth needs to be spoken to be real. I have to go, I said. Before he could respond, I ended the call. That evening, I changed my routine again. I didn't stay inside. At 11:40 p.m., I left the house and walked 3 blocks to a small park at the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass, a couple of benches, and a lamppost that flickered more than it should. I sat on the bench facing the street, the watch on my wrist, my hands resting loosely in my lap. If they were going to observe me, I would give them a clearer view. At 11:59, the air felt heavier. At midnight, the watch began to tick. 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 This time, the figure didn't stay at the edge. He crossed the street. Not directly toward me, but close enough that I could hear the faint sound of his shoes on the pavement. He stopped under the dim edge of the lamppost's light, just enough for me to see more than a silhouette. Male, mid-50s maybe, upright posture, hands relaxed at his sides. Military. Not active duty, but something adjacent. The way he held himself, controlled, measured, spoke of years under command. He didn't speak. Neither did I. The ticking continued. I could feel his attention on me, not invasive, not hostile, evaluating. I met it without challenge, without submission. Just presence. At 12:01, the watch stopped. The silence returned. He held my gaze for a fraction of a second longer, then gave the slightest nod. Acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away. No confrontation, no explanation. Just data collected. I sat there for another minute, letting the moment settle. 7 days, I thought. Why 7? It wasn't arbitrary. Grandpa didn't do arbitrary. 7 days is long enough to test consistency. Long enough for fatigue to set in. Long enough for a person to break routine, to slip, to reveal something they wouldn't on day 1 or 2. This wasn't about a single reaction. It was about endurance. On day 4, the pressure began to build. Not in obvious ways. Nothing dramatic. Just small accumulating strains. A restless night. A misplaced set of keys. A meeting that ran long and left me running behind schedule. At lunch, I noticed the same man from the park, this time in civilian clothes, sitting at a table across the cafe. He didn't look at me directly, but I could feel his awareness. They were closing the distance. Testing different environments. Seeing if my behavior changed under shifting conditions. That evening, I stood in my kitchen staring at the watch as the seconds crept toward midnight. Part of me wanted to confront them. To step outside, call them out, demand answers. But that would have been reaction. Impulse. And if this was what I believed it to be, then that was exactly what they were waiting for. I thought of Grandpa again. Of the way he used to stand in silence when I argued as a teenager, letting me exhaust myself before saying a single sentence that cut through everything. The hardest thing, he once told me, is not acting when you want to. At 11:59, I closed my eyes for a moment. At midnight, the watch began to tick. And this time I stayed exactly where I was. By day 4, the silence around me began to feel crowded. That may sound strange to someone who has never been watched, but anyone who has lived under pressure understands it. Silence changes when there is intent behind it. A quiet room becomes a room with questions in it. An empty sidewalk becomes a place where someone may be measuring your pace, your posture, the way your hand moves when a car passes too slowly. I had lived with tension before. I had stood in briefings where one wrong decision could cost lives. I had walked through places overseas where every window deserved a second glance. But this was different, because it was happening at home in a quiet Virginia town where neighbors raked leaves, children rode bikes, and the church bell still rang on Sundays. Pressure is easier to carry when you know its source. This pressure had no name yet. That morning, I found my keys in the freezer. I stood there with the door open, cold air spilling over my boots, staring at the small metal ring beside a bag of frozen peas. For a moment, I simply looked at it. I knew I had left them on the table. At least I believed I had. Sleep had been thin for 3 nights. My mind had been running calculations I could not write down. Who was following me? Who authorized it? What had Grandpa arranged, and why had he left me ignorant? I picked up the keys and closed the freezer door. Fatigue makes fools of good people, Grandpa used to say. He was right. At base, I made a mistake in a training schedule that I normally would have caught before my first cup of coffee. A young captain pointed it out gently, almost apologetically. "Ma'am, I think the range time overlaps with the medical block." I looked at the paper, saw the error, and nodded. "You're right. Good catch." "No problem, ma'am." But it was a problem. Not because of the schedule, because I felt my patience thin like worn cloth. I corrected it, thanked him again, and went back to my office, closing the door softly behind me. Softly mattered. Slamming a door is still losing control, even if no one calls it that. Around noon, my father called again. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered because avoiding him would have meant he had gained weight in my mind. "Claire," he said without greeting, "we need to talk about your grandfather's study." "What about it?" "There are locked cabinets. I don't have the combinations." "I don't either." "That seems unlikely." "It's true." He made a sound through his nose. "You spent more time in that room than anyone." "I was invited there," I said. "That doesn't mean I had access to everything." There was a pause, and I heard my mother's voice faintly in the background. Something about appraisers, something about antique buyers. My hand tightened around the phone. "Dad," I said carefully, "don't sell his personal military records. Don't tell me what to do with my property." "It's not just property." "It is now." His voice sharpened. "According to the will you seem so willing to respect." There it was, the trap. If I argued, I would sound bitter. If I pleaded, he would enjoy the power. If I threatened, he would have evidence that the watch had not been enough. So I sat still at my desk and looked at the framed photo of my unit on the wall. "Some things deserve care," I said. He laughed. "Care doesn't pay taxes." "No," I said, "but greed collects interest." The line went quiet. For once he had no quick answer. Then he said, lower, meaner, "You know your grandfather saw through you at the end. All that uniform, all that duty talk. He left you a broken watch because that's what you earned." I closed my eyes. Not from pain exactly, from the effort of staying still. He wanted me wounded. He wanted proof that his words could still reach the child in me who had once waited by the window for him to come to school plays and promotion ceremonies. That child still existed. I have learned most adults carry their younger selves like folded letters in an inside pocket. But I did not hand him that letter. "You're angry," I said. "I understand." "Oh, don't patronize me. I hope you take care of the study." Then I ended the call. For the next 10 minutes I sat without moving. My father's words echoed longer than I wanted them to. Not because I believed him, but because insults from family have hooks. Strangers can throw stones and miss. Family knows which window is already cracked. By late afternoon I was running on coffee and discipline. When I returned home, the neighborhood looked too peaceful. A woman across the street was carrying groceries. A retired man 2 houses down waved from his driveway. Somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. Normal life? Mine no longer felt normal. At 7 p.m. I made dinner and barely tasted it. At 8:30 I checked every lock. At 9:15 I took the watch apart as much as I dared using a small screwdriver and the patience of someone handling evidence. Nothing made sense. The mechanism looked dead. No new battery, no visible modification, no transmitter I could identify. At 10 o'clock I put it back together. At 10:45 I nearly called Mr. Callahan. My thumb hovered over his number. Then I remembered his face when he said, "Some things should be earned, not explained." I set the phone down. By 11:30 I knew I was close to my limit. That is the danger point in any test. Not the first shock, not the obvious insult. The danger comes when exhaustion whispers that you deserve relief, that one outburst would be understandable, that anyone in your position would demand answers. And maybe anyone would. But Grandpa had not raised me to be anyone. At 11:57 I walked outside. I did not stay behind curtains that night. I stepped onto the porch in a wool coat, the watch on my wrist, the cold air touching my face. The street was empty except for the parked cars and the dim yellow glow of lamps along the curb. At midnight the watch began to tick. Tick, tick, tick. The man appeared at the far end of the sidewalk. Same posture, same measured pace. He walked toward my house, stopping just beyond the walkway. For the first time anger rose in me, hot and clean. Enough, I wanted to say. My hand curled at my side. He watched me, waiting. That was when I understood. This was the moment they wanted. Not the first night when surprise would excuse me. Not the second or third when curiosity still carried me. Tonight was different. Tonight I was tired, insulted, grieving, and angry. Tonight reaction would feel righteous. I heard Grandpa's voice as clearly as if he stood beside me. The hardest thing is not reacting when you're meant to. So I breathed. In through the nose. Out slowly. I looked at the man, then down at the watch, then back again. I said nothing. At 12:01, the ticking stopped. The man held my eyes for 1 second. Then slowly he gave a small nod. Not approval exactly. Recognition. He turned and disappeared into the dark. I stayed on the porch until my pulse settled. Then I went inside, locked the door, and leaned my forehead lightly against the wood. For the first time that week, tears came. Not many. Just enough to admit I was human. By the 6th morning, I had learned something I hadn't expected. Pressure doesn't always come from what's happening around you. Sometimes it comes from what you choose not to do. For 5 nights, I had watched the same pattern unfold. Midnight, 1 minute, observation, withdrawal. Each time the distance closed a little more. Each time the expectation grew sharper, like a question waiting to be answered. And each time I had chosen not to answer it. That choice had weight. I woke before sunrise on day 6, not because of noise, but because my body no longer trusted rest. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to comfort me. Now it felt like a room waiting for a verdict. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the watch on my wrist. Still. Cracked. Ordinary. If someone had handed it to me without context, I would have called it junk. But context changes value. Grandpa had known that better than anyone. At 600, I laced up my running shoes and stepped outside. The air carried that early spring chill that settles into your lungs and wakes you up faster than coffee. I chose a route that cut through the older neighborhoods again, past the closed diner, the empty schoolyard, and the narrow road lined with mailboxes that leaned just slightly from years of weather. I didn't look for the SUV this time. Instead, I focused on rhythm. Step. Breath. Step. Breath. You learn in the military that consistency under strain is a form of strength. Anyone can perform well when conditions are clear. The real measure is what happens when you don't have answers. Halfway through the run, I caught a reflection in a storefront window. A figure behind me. Not close. Not far. Matching pace. I didn't change direction. I didn't slow down. I let it happen. Because by now I understood something important. They weren't trying to catch me. They were trying to see if I would catch myself. Back home, I showered, dressed, and stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, staring at nothing in particular. The coffee in my hand had gone lukewarm, but I hadn't taken a sip. 7 days, I thought again. Today was day 6. Tomorrow would be the last. Whatever this was, it was building toward something. The question was not what they would do. It was what I would do. Around 10:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Your father is going through your grandfather's study today. If you want anything sentimental, come now. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down. 10 minutes passed before I picked it up again. There are moments in life when 2 paths look equally justified. One pulls you toward confrontation, toward defending what you believe is right. The other pulls you toward restraint, toward letting events unfold without interference. Both can be called strength. Only one aligns with purpose. I drove to the house. The familiar brick exterior looked smaller than I remembered. The flag on the porch had been taken down. The rose bushes were untrimmed. Change shows itself first in the small neglects. Inside, I found my father in the study drawers, open papers stacked on the desk, a box half filled with items he had already decided to sell. He didn't look up when I entered. You're late, he said. I came when I could. You could have come sooner. I didn't respond. My eyes moved around the room. The shelves were half empty. The framed photographs were still there, though some had been turned face down. That bothered me more than anything else. Don't turn those over, I said. He glanced at me. Why not? They're not decorations. They're pictures, he said, and some of them are worth money. I stepped further into the room. They're records, I said, of people who mattered to him. They mattered to him, he corrected, not to me. There it was again. the divide that had always existed between them. I walked to the desk and picked up one of the frames he had set aside. A young soldier barely older than I had been when I first enlisted. Name engraved beneath the photo. Date of death. My grandfather had kept every one of them. "You're not selling these?" I said. My father straightened. "Watch me." I placed the frame back on the desk carefully, deliberately. "This isn't about money." "It's always about money," he snapped. "That's what you don't understand. You can afford not to care because you've never had to rely on it." I almost laughed at that, not out of humor but out of disbelief. "I've relied on a lot of things," I said, "just not that." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You think you're better than me?" "No," I said, "I think we value different things." "That's the same thing." "It isn't." For a moment we stood there, the air between us tight with years of unspoken arguments. Then he shook his head. "Take whatever you want," he said, gesturing vaguely. "But don't pretend it means something more than it does." I looked at the room one more time. Then I made a decision. I took nothing. Not the photographs. Not the books. Not even the small wooden box on the shelf that I remembered Grandpa using for letters. Because taking something in that moment would have turned it into possession. And this, whatever this test was not about possession. It was about understanding. "I'm leaving," I said. "Of course you are," he replied. I walked out without looking back. That evening I prepared differently. Not with more caution. With more intention. At 11:45 p.m., I left the house and walked to the same open area near the park where I had sat 2 nights before. The bench was empty. The street was quiet. I didn't sit this time. I stood. Feet shoulder-width apart. Hands relaxed at my sides. The watch on my wrist. At 11:59 I closed my eyes for a brief second. Not in fear. In focus. At midnight the watch began to tick. 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 The man appeared almost immediately. Closer than before. He didn't stop at the edge of the light this time. He stepped into it. For the first time I saw his face clearly. Calm. Measured. Familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place. He studied me not like an opponent but like an examiner. I met his gaze. Steady. Unflinching. The ticking continued. 30 seconds. 40. 50. At 12:01 it stopped. Silence. The man didn't leave right away. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he inclined his head. Respect. Not given lightly. Then he turned and walked away. I stood there alone, the quiet settling around me once more. Day 7 was coming. And I understood now that whatever happened next would not be about what I had endured. It would be about what I chose. By the 7th morning, I no longer felt hunted. That was the strangest part. For nearly a week, I had lived under observation. I had been followed on morning runs, watched from street corners, measured in silence at midnight. I had been tired, angry, unsettled, and at times close to breaking the quiet discipline my grandfather had spent years building in me. But when day 7 arrived, fear had burned down into something steadier. Acceptance. Not surrender. Not passivity. Acceptance is not giving up. It is standing inside the truth of a moment without wasting strength denying it. I woke before the alarm and made my bed with corners sharp enough to satisfy a drill sergeant. Then I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and placed the old watch in front of me. It looked weaker in daylight. Cracked glass. Worn leather. A dead face pretending it had not come alive every night for 6 nights. I touched the side of the case with my thumb. "What are you trying to tell me, Grandpa?" I whispered. Of course, the watch didn't answer. At 900, I received a call from Mr. Callahan. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Major Whitaker." His voice was low, careful. "Claire, are you all right?" That question told me more than he probably intended. "I'm functioning," I said. A faint pause. "That sounds like your grandfather." "It feels like him too." He exhaled softly. "I can't discuss certain matters yet." Yet I repeated. Another pause. Then he said, "At midnight tonight, go to the old Veterans Hall on Maple Street." I sat very still. "That building has been closed for years." "I know." "Will someone be there?" "Yes." "Are they a threat?" "No." I looked at the watch. Was this my grandfather's doing? Mr. Callahan was silent long enough for the answer to settle before he spoke. Be there at midnight, he said. And Claire? Yes. Go alone. The line ended. For the rest of the day I moved through my duties with a calm that surprised even me. I reviewed reports, corrected a logistical issue, spoke with a young lieutenant who was nervous about her first command evaluation. She stood in my doorway twisting her pen between her fingers. Ma'am, what if I make a mistake? I almost smiled. You will, I said. Her eyes widened. That's not failure, I continued. Failure is refusing to learn from it. Prepare well, tell the truth, and don't let nerves make decisions for you. She nodded slowly, absorbing more than she had expected from a simple question. After she left, I sat for a moment with her fear still in the room. I wondered how many times Grandpa had given me answers that were really meant for later. That evening I did not call my father. I did not drive by the house. I did not search for the man who had been watching me. At 11:30 p.m. I put on my dress uniform. Not because I expected ceremony. Because I finally understood this was one. I stood before the mirror adjusting each part with care. The jacket, the ribbons, the nameplate, the hair pulled neat and tight. My reflection looked composed, but my eyes showed the week I had carried. That was all right. Strength does not require looking untouched. At 11:45 I left my townhouse and drove through quiet streets toward Maple Street. The town had mostly gone dark. Porch lights glowed here and there. A flag shifted gently outside the post office. Somewhere in the distance a train horn sounded long and lonely. The old Veterans Hall stood near the corner brick walls, dark windows boarded from the inside. The sign above the door faded by years of weather. I remembered coming there with Grandpa when I was little. There had been pancake breakfasts, Memorial Day meetings, old men telling stories that children were too young to understand, but somehow knew were sacred. I parked across the street. At 11:58 I stepped out of the car. The air was cold enough to sharpen every breath. The watch sat in my palm now, not on my wrist. I wanted to feel it when it happened. At 11:59 a black sedan turned onto Maple Street with its headlights off. It rolled to the curb across from the hall and stopped. I did not move. At exactly midnight the watch began to tick. 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 The sound seemed louder outside, though that was impossible. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, the same man I had seen all week. But now he wore a dark formal service uniform. His silver hair was neatly cut. His face, fully visible beneath the street lamp, carried lines earned by discipline and grief. He walked toward me. Not as a stranger. Not as a threat. As a man completing an order. At 12:01 the watch stopped. He stopped in front of me, brought his heels together and saluted. Ma'am, he said quietly, you passed. For 1 second I could not speak. Then training returned my voice. Passed what? He lowered his hand. My name is Colonel David Mercer, retired. I served under your grandfather for 14 years. The name hit something in my memory. Mercer. I had heard it before, spoken by Grandpa with rare warmth. You've been following me, I said. Yes, ma'am. Why? Because General Whitaker requested it. I looked down at the watch, then back at him, before he died. Long before Colonel Mercer said, he set this in motion nearly 2 years ago. The cold seemed to deepen around us. He knew my father would get the house, I said. He knew your father would want the house, Mercer corrected. There's a difference. I stared at him. Colonel Mercer reached into his coat and removed a sealed envelope. My name was written across it in my grandfather's handwriting. My chest tightened. He wanted you evaluated under uncertainty, Mercer said. Not danger, not harm, uncertainty. He said any soldier can perform under orders, but leadership reveals itself when there are no instructions. I opened the envelope with careful hands. Inside was a single sheet. Claire, if you are reading this, then you did what I believed you would do. You stayed steady when insulted. You observed without panic. You showed restraint when anger would have been easier. That is not weakness. That is command. Your father measures inheritance by possession. I measure it by trust. The watch was never the gift. It was the key. I had to stop reading for a moment. Colonel Mercer waited without rushing me. When I looked up, he handed me a small brass key attached to a worn tag. "Veterans Hall," he said. I looked at the dark building behind him. "This place." "Not just this place," he said. "Your grandfather spent 20 years building something here, quietly, privately. He called it the Whitaker Trust." "For what?" "For veterans who fall through cracks," Mercer said. "Widows, disabled servicemen, families waiting on benefits, soldiers too proud to ask for help. He funded it through assets your father knew nothing about." My throat tightened. "The house and money my parents got." "Real," Mercer said, "but not the legacy." He turned toward the old hall. "General Whitaker didn't leave you less major." He opened the door with his own key and warm light spilled from inside. "He left you what mattered most." Inside, the old Veterans Hall time had not been abandoned. That was my first thought when Colonel Mercer opened the door and stepped aside. From the street, the building had looked forgotten, dark brick, faded sign-boarded windows. But inside, warm lamps glowed over polished wooden floors. The walls had been repaired. The ceiling fans turned slowly. Along one side of the room hung framed photographs of veterans from different wars, different ages, different uniforms, all looking out with the same quiet dignity. At the far end stood a long table covered with neatly organized folders. And beside it were 6 people waiting. 2 elderly men in suits, a woman in her 70s with a silver braid and eyes sharp enough to cut through excuses, a younger man with a prosthetic leg, a middle-aged woman holding a notebook, and Mr. Callahan standing with both hands folded over his cane. No one clapped. No one made a speech. They simply stood when I entered. That nearly broke me more than applause would have. Colonel Mercer spoke first. "Major Whitaker, welcome to the Whitaker Trust." I looked around the hall, then at the photographs, then at the folders waiting on the table. "My grandfather did all this." "For 20 years, Mr. Callahan said, quietly. The woman with the silver braid stepped forward. "Your grandfather helped my husband get his benefits after 3 denials. He helped my daughter keep her home after her husband died. He never wanted his name used." A younger man touched the edge of the table. "He paid for my ramp before the VA paperwork came through." Another man said he covered rent for families when pride kept them from asking. Each sentence landed softly, but together they carried more weight than any bank statement ever could. I walked slowly along the wall of photographs. Some faces were young, some old, some smiling, some solemn. Beneath each frame was a name, a service branch, and a small brass plate that read, "No one who served should have to stand alone." Grandpa's words. I swallowed hard. "What happens now?" I asked. Mr. Callahan opened one of the folders. "Your grandfather placed the trust under a private board. Colonel Mercer and I have served as temporary stewards, but his instructions were clear. If you passed the evaluation, you would become the principal trustee." I turned to him, "And if I hadn't?" Colonel Mercer answered, "The board would continue without family control." That was when I understood the true shape of his final lesson. Grandpa had not tested me to reward me. He had tested me to protect them. The people in this room, the widows, the disabled veterans, the families waiting in offices filling out forms trying not to drown in silence. This was not a prize. It was a responsibility. I looked down at the watch in my hand. For 7 nights I had thought it was counting down to an answer. But it had been counting down to duty. Mr. Callahan handed me another envelope. "There is one more letter." I opened it with slower hands this time. "Claire, if you are standing in that hall, then you already know the truth. Money can be inherited by blood. Trust must be inherited by character. You may feel angry with your father. You have the right. But do not let his hunger teach you bitterness. The opposite of greed is not poverty. It is stewardship. Use what I built. Improve it. Question it. Protect it. And when you are tired, remember this command is not about being obeyed. It is about being worthy of obedience. I loved you more than I knew how to say." "Grandpa?" This time I did cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a few tears that slipped down before I could stop them. No one looked away, and no one made me feel ashamed. A week later, my father came to the Veterans Hall. I had expected anger. He arrived with plenty of it. He marched in wearing a suit and a wounded expression, demanding to know why strangers were using the family name. I let him speak. I let him accuse. Then I showed him the wall. Not the legal papers first, not the trust documents, the wall. I showed him the faces of people Grandpa had carried when no one was watching. I showed him the names. I showed him the quiet work that had meant more to his father than the house, the land, or the money he had fought so hard to possess. At first, Dad scoffed. Then he went quiet. Then he stopped in front of one photograph, a young man in uniform smiling with one arm around my grandfather. "Who is that?" he asked. "Private Daniel Reeves," I said. "He saved Grandpa's life in Korea. Grandpa supported his widow for 31 years. Dad stared at the photograph for a long time. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as cruel, not as powerful, not even as selfish. Just small. A man who had mistaken being left property for being loved. "I didn't know," he said. "No," I answered gently. "You didn't ask." He flinched, but he didn't argue. That was not a perfect reconciliation. Life rarely gives those. My father did not become humble overnight. My mother did not suddenly understand sacrifice. But something shifted. He returned 2 boxes from Grandpa's study, photographs, letters, service records, things he had almost sold because he did not know how to measure their worth. It was a beginning. And sometimes a beginning is mercy. Months later, the old Veterans Hall reopened officially. Not with cameras or politicians, but with coffee-folding chairs and people who needed help finding their next step. I kept Grandpa's watch on my desk. It never ticked again. It didn't need to. I had heard what it came to say. My grandfather did not leave me a mansion. He left me a mission. He taught me that revenge does not always mean destroying the people who hurt you. Sometimes the strongest revenge is becoming exactly what they said you were: not: steady, honorable, trusted, and useful to others. And if this story stayed with you, maybe it is because someone once measured your worth the wrong way too. Maybe they looked at money, status, age, or mistakes and missed the character you carried quietly. So today I hope you remember this: your value is not decided by the people who overlook you. It is revealed by what you do when no one explains the test. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in duty, forgiveness, and quiet strength. And if you'd like more stories like this, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with us.